Hello everybody, this video is all about the hanging pawn structure in chess, and it will cover everything. We're going to look at the themes and ideas for both sides. We're then going to look at game example after game example to really cement home these concepts, and by the end of this video, you're going to be able to navigate these sort of positions with complete confidence. But right before we jump into all of that, there are two very quick things that I want to mention. First of all, this is part of a larger masterclass that I'm creating all about pawn structures. You can see the 7 chapters that are in this masterclass on the screen right now. We are in chapter 1, the hanging pawns, but there are 6 more exciting pawn structures that we are going to explore in this masterclass. And I've actually picked these pawn structures because they complement each other in the sense that they differ in very unique ways. And so if you study all of these, you're really going to be able to create plans in all sorts of different pawn structures. And this brings me to the second point that I quickly want to emphasize. Why should we even learn about pawn structures at all? And the truth is, pawns in chess are extremely crucial to understand because they very much dictate the plans that you should go for. Think about it this way. Suppose you have a knight on f3 and you wanted a plan that would require the knight on a different square like e3. Okay, the knight is very flexible. It can move to help and aid in your plan. However, pawns, every time you move a pawn, you create more weaknesses. They are far more static pawn structures, and therefore if you want to make a plan, you should make it based off of your pawn structure. You should not make a pawn structure based off of your plan, if that makes sense. And so that is the massive benefit of studying these pawn structures. You're going to be able to create effective plans in all different types of structures. And today we're starting with the hanging pawns, so let's jump right in. Now, the hanging pawn structure occurs when you have a C and a D pawn, and you do not have a B or an E pawn. And this means that although these pawns are together, they are independent in the sense that they are their own island. They don't have pawns that can support them. So first of all, let's begin by talking about the themes for both players. So from White's point of view, they have a massive space advantage in the queen side and in the center. And generally speaking, they're going to be able to position their pieces in very aggressive and ambitious squares. Additionally, they also kind of control the lever in this position, meaning they are the ones that can always push d5 or c4, c5 and change the position if it is advantageous at that time. So they have the dynamic benefit of being able to kind of control the pawn pushes in the position. However, in exchange for these benefits, these two pawns, as I mentioned, are not very much supported on the left and right side, and therefore they are weaknesses. And so, as Black's point of view, they want to put their rooks, for example, on the C and D file. They want to maneuver their knights in such a way to target these pawns, and in general, they very much go after these pawns one by one, trying to pick them up, and that reveals the plans for both sides. As White, you want to play a bit more aggressively. You want to make sure your pawns are defended, and at some point, you want to prepare d4, d5, which notice also comes with the added benefit of opening up this diagonal towards the king. That is a common theme. We're going to look at a couple of games that show this in this video, but you could also look at going for c4, c5, and in general just opening up the position at the right moment. And as Black, you want to keep the position kind of closed. You want to maybe transition into an endgame. It's helpful to trade pieces because then these pawns become sitting ducks, and really you're just trying to add as much pressure as possible. I do want to show you the openings that hanging pawn structures can arise from, and generally it's going to be d4 and c4 based openings. And when both players, when both pawns are traded in the center, these sort of structures can arrive on the board. And so, for example, here, if Black chooses to take twice, we have the hanging pawn structure. Alternatively, in a very similar position, we could see Black getting the hanging pawn structure if White decides to take twice. And there we have the C and D pawn hanging pawn structure. So a very quick examples of how these pawn structures can arrive, because they are very common from these d4 setups. So game example number 1. All of these games, by the way, will be linked down below. There's going to be a PGN file if you want to look through them. And the opening is not so much of a concern as long as you recognize that at some point, indeed, white reaches the hanging pawn structure, and now kind of the important strategic fun begins. So let's look at this game from white's point of view. What white wants to do is, as I mentioned, at some point prepare the move d4, d5, or c4, c5. As you're going to see, white positions their pieces with an eye towards the king side. They're trying to create a king side attack, and therefore the prospect of going d4, d5 paired with a bishop on this diagonal is the idea that white is going for, and it looks very juicy in this position. So you can see bishop c3 hinting towards this idea. The bishop could also be fianchettoed on b2 with a similar purpose along this diagonal. Now the rook activates h3, playing slow, playing steady. And here, after the move knight h5, this doesn't look like a very strong move. It looks a little bit awkward, the knight sitting on the side of the board. And tactics might already exist. So some of you might consider bishop takes h7. Unfortunately, after king takes knight g5, the king can actually defend the knight. You do have this tactic of taking on f7 and taking on h5, but you are down material and you don't have the necessary firepower to continue the attack, and that is largely due to the fact that the bishop is not in the game. And so if we take a step back, white wants to go for this tactic. The bishop needs to be activated. Let's do it. d5. Again, this is the luxury of having the hanging pawns. You have the ability to push the pawn structure up whenever you see it fit. And so here, the move d5, very effective. And they cannot take because of this idea that I just showed. It becomes far stronger because after takes the same position, except now bishop takes g7 comes, the rook can come into the game. This is going to lead to a massive attack that is going to be unbearable. And so after d5, black cannot take this pawn. They played the move knight to c5 in the game. But here, the very simple knight g5, the attack continues. There's pressure now on h5. And after the move g6 defending, bishop e2 was played. And here we see a second advantage of going d5. Not only is the bishop opened, but the square in front of the pawn d4 is now available for the queen to take advantage of. We see this immediately happening here. There is now so many threats of mate. Queen f8 is necessary to defend, but the queen slides over h5. And after the move is played to defend, we have bishop to g4. There's now too much pressure on e6. And the position completely crumbles for black here. If they defend this pawn again, notice obviously they can't take because of the pin with mate on h7. And therefore, if we go back for a second, they can choose to defend, but now we can just add an extra attacker. They can choose to go f5, but now we can crash through with knight takes e6. The attacking motifs of this exact position are not so much in the scope of this video. It's still an interesting position, so I'll quickly demonstrate a couple of the lines. There's the threat of the fork, but notice that the job of the hanging pawns from white's perspective has already been completed, right? The position immediately opened up after we went d5, and we had the ability to do so because of our control and space advantage in the center, and now we have the entire attack coming. Queen h6, queen f6, threatening f7, and there's just no way to defend. Now, the second game example that we have is pretty similar in the sense that we are going to again look at this from the perspective of the player who possesses the hanging pawn structure. But this time, notice that the idea of going and pushing the d-pawn is less effective. We do not have a fianchettoed bishop. We do not have the necessary pieces to form an attack over here. So the idea of pushing d4 is just not as appealing. And therefore, we look at the other pawn as a way to make progress here, and c4 becomes far more interesting. So you'll see that very soon black goes for this idea. Now, from white's perspective, again, you want to add as much pressure as possible on these pawns. So white initiates a very strong plan, knight e1, bringing the knight to d3, putting more pressure on c5. Now, black in this position could defend the pawn, but then white's going to add even more pressure, for example, rook ac1, and at some point you're going to have to push anyways, and so black decides to push immediately with c4. And the position has just changed greatly because on one hand, okay, we've made the pawn structure a little bit less connected. There are some weak dark squares now. You can certainly imagine some pressure on this backward pawn on d5. However, in exchange for this, notice that black has the ability to create a big and very ambitious pawn mass on the queen side, right? c4 is just the beginning. We want to go queen to b4, and after a trade that will presumably happen, we have the ability to just continue pushing and making progress, and you're going to see this sort of idea come to light very soon. So first of all, pressure on b2. That's another bonus of the pawn on c4. The b3 move is just far less effective here. So they have to spend a move defending, bishop f5, attacking the rook, knight f6, defending over the center, and that is the key. With the hanging pawns, you always want to double, triple check that every pawn is nicely secured, because if you lose one, you're very likely to lose the other. They work in a pair like that, where they're sort of strong together, but very weak alone. So rook to d2. Now g5 comes into play. Very strong move. If the knight simply moves away, the knight is going to enter the center, and after the rook moves, this is kind of what I was talking about. You could see a position like this where these pawns are just running, right? I mean, at this point, there's pressure here. If you defend b3 utilizing the pin as well over here, everything falls. And that would be a nightmare. So after the move g5, the knight doesn't have the time to retreat. It had to sack itself, and white tried to claim compensation, but it just doesn't exist, especially after black wins another pawn. And at this point, the conversion is super simple. We have bishop f5, and here white resigned because obviously they're just down too much material, and black is going for a huge attack. So a very simple example of this c4 idea, but it's actually also as simple as it needs to be. I mean, we brought the pieces into the game, we made sure the center was secure, and we used this c4 pawn as a means to initiate a queenside attack. So you can see we advanced the queen, we put pressure on b2. This is a very effective pawn break with the c4 pawn if you want to continue attacking on the queen side as opposed to the d pawn for attacking on the king side. And this takes us to our final game, where this time we are going to look at this from the perspective of the white side facing the hanging pawns. How can we try to play effectively against this? Well, the main idea is to add as much pressure as you can into these pawns and make the prospect of pushing the pawns as least appealing as it can be. So first of all, castling, developing, everything's natural, and a very aggressive idea here, g4, f5. If you take the knight, the queen is trapped after bishop f4, so the queen had to retreat. But now knight a4, sorry, and there's pressure on c5 already, and the center begins to collapse a little bit. And it was at this moment that black made a massive mistake. Again, the only way that the hanging pawn structure actually means something is if you can use it and gain an initiative pushing c4 or d4. And so both of these moves would have been fine. c4, for example, and black is totally fine here. Or alternatively, going for the move d4 and maybe utilizing this open and weak diagonal. And again, black is completely fine in this endgame position. However, they neglected to push their pawns, and then the pawns, as I mentioned earlier, become sitting ducks. They become very weak, and if you don't make anything of them, they're not worth anything. So after queen to c7 was played here, we had the move bishop f4, eyeing the queen, and here bishop to d6 was played, but now knight takes c5 is possible. Now, you're not actually winning a pawn because via a nice tactic, they're winning back the material. So material is equal in this position. However, what you've done is you've traded the pawn on c5 for the pawn on e3. This is a huge worthwhile trade because, as I mentioned, when one of the hanging pawn falls, the other one is bound to fall as well because it becomes a very isolated and weak pawn. And here white went for a simple plan of trading pieces and targeting this isolated pawn. We're going to talk about isolated pawns in the next chapter a bit more in depth, but suffice to say that this one is just not standing. You could take it immediately, or to add insult to injury, knight h5 was played here, and you're winning both of the pawns in just huge effect. Then you win a third pawn, and in just moments, black resigned in this position here, as they should, of course. They're completely lost. And so, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully you enjoyed the video. Those are the general considerations to keep in mind when you're playing with or against the hanging pawn structure. Make sure you subscribe if you're new around here, like the video if you learned something new from it. Stay tuned for the remainder of this pawn structure masterclass, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.